Three girls came to the mansion to marry the son of a wheelchair-bound millionaire. But what happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching us from. The rain had not touched the wide grounds of the James estate in weeks. Dry wind rustled through the tall hedges lining the property, whispering secrets no one cared to hear. Inside the stone walls of the grand mansion, silence pressed down like a weight, thick and suffocating. Every room gleamed with polished floors and chandeliers, every surface untouched, every corner too perfect. Yet the house felt empty, not because it lacked things, but because it lacked life. In a far wing of the estate, behind double oak doors that remained shut day and night, sat the only son of Madeline James. His name was Elias. Once known for his strength, charm, and relentless ambition, Elias now passed his days in solitude, wheeling himself from one side of his dimly lit room to the other, as if movement, any movement, might fill the void inside. But it never did. No amount of books or music or the distant murmur of birds through his window could reach the place where hope had once lived. Elias was 26. He had graduated top of his class in architecture, had already begun designing sustainable housing prototypes, and was once the golden boy of every gala, charity event, and magazine feature. But that was before the accident. Before the screech of tires and the metal crush that shattered not only his spine, but his world. When he woke in the hospital weeks later, paralyzed from the waist down, the pain was not in his body. It was in the way people looked at him. The pity, the awkward smiles, the silence. He lost his legs to that crash, yes. But what truly broke him was the betrayal. His girlfriend of 3 years, a woman he had once believed would be his wife, left without a word, vanishing like a ghost. She couldn't handle it, she wrote in a message, couldn't watch him deteriorate. As if he had died, as if he no longer mattered. And so Elias built walls no one could climb. He refused therapy. He refused visitors. He even refused the staff who had raised him like family. Only his mother dared to enter his space, and even she found herself reduced to silence under the chill in her son's eyes. Madeline James stood at the window of her study on the 3rd floor, watching the fading sun stretch long fingers over the garden. She was a striking woman, early 50s, graceful yet formidable, the kind of woman who could command attention in any boardroom without raising her voice. But now, with her son locked away in darkness, she felt powerless. She had conquered business empires, outmaneuvered rivals, built one of the most respected philanthropic networks in the state. But she could not reach her own child. He was slipping away, slowly, quietly, and Madeline refused to let that happen. She turned from the window and sat at her desk. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for a folder, thick with notes, names, background checks. The plan she had come up with was unconventional, perhaps even manipulative, but she believed in it. She had to. Nothing else had worked. No doctor, no specialist, no medication had brought Elias back to life. Her son needed something different. Not a cure, but a spark. 3 profiles lay open before her. 3 young women, each carefully selected, each unaware of the true reason for their invitation. They would come under the pretense of attending a personal growth retreat, a holistic program designed for women seeking clarity and purpose. They would stay at the estate for 2 weeks. During that time, they would meet Elias. No promises, no conditions, just presence. Madeline knew it was a gamble. These girls were not saints. She knew they came with ambition, desires, flaws, but perhaps within that imperfect mix, one might carry something real, something her son could see through his pain. The first was Claire Bennett, 25, a popular model and social media influencer. Stunning, charismatic, and unapologetically vain. Claire was used to admiration, luxury, and control. She saw the world as a marketplace and people as assets. Madeline had no illusions about her motives. Claire would come if she thought there was opportunity. The second was Olivia Cross, 26, poised and polished. A young entrepreneur with a background in retail fashion, Olivia had grown up middle class but carried herself like royalty. Ambitious and strategic, she saw connections as stepping stones. She would come, surely, if she believed the right doors would open. The third, and perhaps the most unpredictable, was Jane Holloway. 23, a lifestyle vlogger and digital storyteller with a modest following. Jane was energetic, creative, and sharp, but unlike the others, she carried something else. A need to prove herself. She had grown up in a small town, raised by a single father. She had learned to watch before speaking. Her application had arrived late, almost by accident. Madeline had watched one of her videos, not the trendy ones, but the one where she interviewed elderly residents of a local hospice. Something in that footage had struck her. The decision was made. 2 days later, the first black cars pulled up to the estate. Staff carried sleek luggage through the grand entrance. The girls arrived separately, greeted by polite but distant housekeepers. They were led to their individual rooms, lavish, sunlit chambers with large beds and private terraces overlooking the hills. Claire arrived in designer heels, her eyes scanning every inch of marble, art, and architecture with calculated curiosity. Olivia wore a chic navy pantsuit, noting the brand of the wallpaper and the subtle elegance of the lighting fixtures. Jane, by contrast, walked in wide-eyed, holding her camera bag like a shield, already thinking of captions she might use, though something in the air warned her not to film just yet. That evening, they dined in the East Hall. A long mahogany table stretched between two marble fireplaces. The lighting was soft, the meal impeccable. Madeline sat at the head of the table, gracious and composed. She introduced herself, spoke of the program, the goals, the freedom they would have to explore and reflect. The girls smiled, each interpreting her words through their own lens. Then the room shifted. The double doors opened and Elias entered. He moved with slow, practiced motions, guiding his wheelchair with quiet precision. He was tall, even-seated, with rich brown skin and dark, unreadable eyes. His hair was cropped close, his jaw unshaven. He wore a simple black shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow. The only sound in the room was the soft hum of the chandelier above. No one spoke. Elias glanced around the table once, then wheeled past them without a word. He stopped near the window, turned slightly, and stared out at the garden. Claire whispered, "Is that him?" Jane nodded faintly, her gaze fixed on him, camera forgotten. After a minute, Elias turned his chair toward the door and exited. The silence lingered. Madeline raised her glass, her voice calm. "Welcome to James' house. May you find here not what you expect, but what you need." Later that night, Elias sat alone in his room, staring at the ceiling. He had seen the way they looked at him like he was a challenge, a project, a wounded prince in a castle of gold. He clenched his fists and whispered to himself, "They'll be gone in a week." But somewhere in the back of his mind, he remembered one pair of eyes that didn't blink, didn't pity. Jane's. He closed his eyes. The silence in the mansion deepened. Morning arrived over the James estate with a kind of theatrical precision, casting golden light through the floor-length windows of each guest room. The scent of freshly baked bread wafted through the halls, trailing behind uniformed staff who moved quietly, efficiently, as though trained not to disturb the atmosphere of elegant calm that defined the mansion. Somewhere down the corridor, the low murmur of a vacuum cleaner faded behind a closing door. Claire was the first to rise. She stood before the mirror, adjusting her silk robe, inspecting every detail of her reflection as though she were preparing for a photo shoot rather than breakfast. Her platinum blonde hair was pinned up loosely, her features sharpened with expert makeup. She took one glance out the terrace window and smirked. "Well," she whispered to herself, "at least the money is real." Across the hall, Olivia sipped her coffee in silence, her tablet propped up beside her croissant. Her brow was furrowed, not out of concern, but calculation. She had spent the early hours scanning local news, financial records, and business press releases related to the James family. She now knew more about Madeline's holdings than most journalists. Olivia had no interest in wasting time on small talk or casual charm. She was here for strategy, and Elias, whether he liked it or not, was part of the deal. Downstairs, Jane wandered through the east wing in slippers and a hoodie, her camera bag slung lazily over one shoulder. She hadn't dared record anything yet. Something about the house, the way the staff spoke in hushed tones, the way the furniture stood as if staged for inspection, felt sacred, like a theater set before the curtain rose. She didn't want to be the fool who tripped the alarm. Still, her mind raced. She had already written 2 possible introductions for a video series, Inside the World of the Untouchables, or Retreat of the Rich, What They Don't Want You to Know. But when she thought about Elias, his silence, his eyes, it didn't feel like content. It felt heavier. There was something fragile beneath the surface, like a mirror under pressure. And Jane, for once, wasn't sure she wanted to shatter it. At breakfast, the girls were seated together at a smaller round table in the sunroom. The walls were glass and morning light spilled in from every angle. A housekeeper in gray and white poured fresh juice into crystal glasses without a sound. "Did you see him last night?" Claire asked, slicing into a piece of melon. Her voice was casual, but her eyes were alert. Olivia glanced up briefly. "Yes." "What did you think?" Claire leaned in. "Honestly, I think he didn't want us here." Jane said nothing. She focused on her toast. Claire scoffed lightly. "Well, obviously. But let's be real. He's still gorgeous. I mean, you saw that jawline. If I can get him to open his mouth and say something human, this might be less boring than I thought." "You think this is about flirting?" Olivia asked flatly. Claire shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not. But if this is what I think it is, a test, a setup, whatever, then I'm not losing to someone who films cat videos in a hoodie." Jane looked up, unfazed. "They're not cat videos, and this isn't a competition." Claire's laugh was sharp and empty. "Sweetheart, everything's a competition, especially when billionaires are involved." Before Jane could reply, a quiet voice cut across the room. "Good morning, ladies." They turned to see Madeline James standing in the doorway, dressed in a crisp white blouse and tailored beige trousers. Her presence was magnetic without being loud. "I hope you're settling in," she continued, walking toward them. "Today, I want each of you to take some time to enjoy the grounds. There are no formal activities planned. Just observe, relax, and listen." "To what?" Olivia asked politely. "To what the house tells you," Madeline replied with a faint smile. "It's old, but very alive." She turned to leave, then paused. "Elias will be around. He may not speak much. Don't take it personally." And then she was gone. By midday, the girls were scattered across the estate. Claire lounged by the pool, tanning in a designer bikini and oversized sunglasses, flipping through a magazine she didn't read. Olivia walked the perimeter of the garden, noting the security layout, the placement of staff, the rare orchids by the fountain. Jane, however, found herself in the small library at the rear of the house. It was dim and cool, the shelves lined with thick volumes no one had touched in years. She sat by the window, reading an old illustrated book about African architecture, surprised by the handwritten notes in the margins. When Elias entered the room, she didn't hear him at first. He moved silently, his chair rolling over the rug like a whisper. He was dressed plainly again, a navy sweater and soft gray pants. He said nothing, only stopped near a shelf and pulled down a book. Jane looked up slowly. Their eyes met. "Hi," she said, her voice gentle. He didn't respond. He looked at her, then at the book in his hand, then turned his chair and rolled away. She didn't call after him. Later that evening, the girls were invited to another meal, this time a bit more formal. The dining room was warmer, candles lit along the table, the chandelier dimmed to a golden glow. The staff served without words, as usual. A string quartet played faintly from a speaker hidden somewhere in the ceiling. Elias entered late. He didn't speak. He moved to his place at the far end of the table and sat without ceremony. He barely glanced at the women. Claire leaned toward Olivia. "He's brooding," she whispered. "It's hot." Elias turned his head. "I can hear you." Her face froze. "You're not here for me," he said flatly, his voice like stone. "You're here because my mother thinks I need fixing, or company, or some romantic comedy miracle." He looked directly at Claire. "I didn't ask for you." Claire blinked. You're not subtle. None of you are. This house has seen more lies than you can imagine. You think I'm going to fall for fake smiles and designer perfume?" "Elias," Madeline said softly, but he ignored her. "I'll make this easy," he continued. "Do what you want. Wander the halls, take your photos, eat the food, but leave me alone." He wheeled himself backward and exited the room. Silence fell. Claire sat back, stunned. Olivia shook her head, muttering, "Well, that was direct." Only Jane seemed unaffected. She returned to her plate, took another bite, and continued eating as though nothing had happened. That night, as the girls prepared for bed, tension simmered beneath the surface. Claire paced her room, fuming. Olivia typed rapidly into her phone, sending updates to someone with no name. Jane sat on her bed, watching old videos on her phone, then slowly began deleting them. In the guest room beside hers, Elias lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought of Jane's face in the library. She hadn't smiled at him. She hadn't fawned. She had just looked, really looked. He wasn't sure why that bothered him more than anything else. He closed his eyes. The house creaked as it settled for the night, but the silence was no longer empty. It was full of questions. The following morning unfolded beneath a silver sky. The clouds hung low, heavy with the promise of rain that never seemed to come, and the air in the James estate felt unusually dense, as if it, too, had overheard the tension that had sliced through the dinner table the night before. The staff moved with heightened awareness, polishing surfaces with more fervor than necessary, refilling glasses that were still full, their eyes avoiding both the guests and the family. Something had changed. Elias had not slept. Instead, he had spent the early hours wheeling through the darkened corridors of the mansion, pausing by windows, pressing his palm against the cold glass as he stared into the garden beyond. He was angry, yes, but more than that, he was curious. He could not shake the image of Jane's expressionless face during his outburst at dinner. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't forced a reaction, hadn't played the expected role of hurt or confused guest. That kind of neutrality felt unfamiliar, almost disarming, and that was precisely what bothered him. By the time dawn broke, he was already in his study, hunched over architectural sketches he no longer had the will to complete. The blank spaces in his blueprints mirrored the void inside him. He wanted something to disrupt the quiet, to expose the lies he could smell like cheap perfume. His mother's plan, in his eyes, was little more than a circus act. And these women, players wearing masks far too thin for his liking, he needed to test them. When Madeline entered the room mid-morning, she was surprised to find him awake and alert, already dressed, eyes burning with a kind of purpose she hadn't seen in months. "You've decided something," she said quietly, more a statement than a question. "Yes," Elias replied without looking up. "It's time we separate who's pretending from who's real." A few hours later, the girls were gathered in the drawing room, summoned by a note delivered to each of their doors. They sat on plush velvet chairs spaced evenly in a circle, the kind of arrangement designed to feel intimate, but always felt vaguely clinical. Claire crossed her legs and scrolled through her phone, sighing theatrically. Olivia sat with her back straight, hands folded over her lap, lips pressed into a line. Jane was the last to arrive, hair damp from the shower, a book still tucked under her arm. Elias entered a moment later, followed closely by Madeline. He didn't sit. Instead, he positioned himself near the fireplace and turned to face them. "I have a proposition," he said. Claire perked up. "In the mornings, starting tomorrow, each of you will be taken to a small clinic about 20 minutes from here. It's a pediatric rehabilitation center my family supports. Children live there. Children with permanent injuries, conditions, and disabilities." Olivia blinked. "Okay." Elias's face remained expressionless. "You'll spend 1 hour with them every day. No makeup, no phones, no distractions, just your hands, your time, and your eyes. No cameras, no audience." Claire laughed once, incredulously. "You're serious?" "Yes." "Do we have a choice?" Olivia asked, though she already knew the answer. "Of course," Elias said smoothly. "You can pack and leave at any time." Jane watched him carefully, but said nothing. "Why?" Claire asked, folding her arms. Elias looked directly at her. "Because I've met too many people who said all the right things and did none of them. I don't care about what you say to me. I care about what you do when no one's watching." Madeline remained silent throughout. It was Elias's game now. The next morning arrived with a bite in the wind. The girls were woken earlier than usual and ushered into a waiting SUV. None of them spoke during the drive. Claire wore an expression of detached disdain, her bare face pale without foundation. Olivia looked determined but tense. Jane watched the trees blur past the window, her hands resting on the camera bag she hadn't brought. The clinic sat at the edge of a rural village, a modest building surrounded by a rusting fence and a small playground with fading paint. The inside smelled of antiseptic and something sweeter, like cinnamon and worn books. Nurses in pale blue uniforms moved between rooms, and the distant sound of children laughing or crying echoed faintly through the corridors. The introductions were brief. A woman named Nurse Tilda explained their tasks: folding laundry, reading stories, helping with feeding schedules, or simply sitting with the children and talking. The simplicity of the work was misleading. It required more than strength. It required patience, empathy, and attention. Claire was assigned to help a 5-year-old boy with cerebral palsy assemble wooden puzzles. Within 20 minutes, she was biting her lip and tapping her manicured nails on the table, clearly frustrated. Olivia helped prepare lunch trays, but recoiled when a child sneezed near her. She spent most of the hour checking the time on the wall clock. Jane was asked to sit with a girl who had lost her lower limbs in a house fire. They drew together. Jane asked questions, listened. She didn't notice how much time had passed until a nurse gently reminded her the hour was up. Back at the mansion, the atmosphere had shifted. Claire refused to talk about the experience. Olivia gave vague diplomatic answers when Madeline asked how it went. Jane disappeared into the garden with a sketchpad she had found in the library. Elias watched them all from the second-floor balcony. He noted everything. The next few days followed the same pattern. Mornings at the clinic, afternoons at the estate. Each woman responded differently. Claire began to skip tasks, claiming headaches. Olivia tried harder to be seen, offering to cook once, which resulted in her burning rice and snapping at a maid. Jane, meanwhile, kept going back. Not because she was told to, but because she wanted to. She started arriving early, staying late, helping staff with things outside her assigned duties. And she stopped filming. Entirely. On the 5th day, Elias approached his mother in the solarium. "She's the only one who's not playing a role," he said simply. Madeline nodded. "I know. She doesn't try to impress me. She doesn't need to." Elias paused. "I want to know more." That afternoon, he arranged for all 3 girls to join him on a walk through the property, his first extended time spent with them since their arrival. A staff member assisted with the trails, and though he remained in his chair, he was more present than he had been in weeks. They passed through the orchard, the greenhouse, the reflecting pool, and finally reached the north gardens, an area he rarely visited. The sky had cleared by then, and golden light spilled across the grass. It was here he gave them a challenge. "Each of you will plant something here," he said. "You'll care for it daily. No help, no excuses. If it dies, it dies. But you'll still show up." Claire rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath. "What's the point?" Olivia asked. "We're not gardeners." "You don't have to be," Elias replied. "You just have to try." The next morning, Jane arrived early, a small packet of lavender seeds in hand. She dug into the soil with her bare fingers, unbothered by the mud. Elias watched her from a distance, hidden behind the hedges. Claire never returned to the plot. Olivia came once, dropped a potted orchid into the dirt without removing its plastic container, and left. Later that evening, Elias sat at his desk, flipping through the pages of his old sketchbook. For the first time in months, he picked up a pencil and began to draw. The lines were hesitant at first, but then they became sure. He drew the garden. And in it, a girl kneeling in the soil, her head bowed, her hands in the earth, not because anyone asked her to, but because she chose to. He paused. He knew the others would leave. Maybe soon. But Jane? He wasn't sure. And for the first time since the accident, he didn't fear the uncertainty. The lavender had begun to sprout. It was early morning, and the north garden still glistened with dew. The air smelled of wet earth and new life, and the sun, golden and cautious, spread across the hedges in slow motion. Jane knelt near the little patch she had planted days earlier, her palms covered in soil, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. She tilted her head as she examined the shy green tips that peeked above the dirt, her breath catching slightly in her throat. She didn't smile, not yet, but her eyes softened. It had survived. Despite the cold nights, the gusty winds, and her uncertainty, it had survived. What Jane didn't know was that Elias was watching her from the terrace once again. He had made a habit of it now, rising earlier than usual, sometimes even before the staff. He would sit alone in his wheelchair, wrapped in a thick sweater, a blanket over his legs, and observe the garden in silence. He saw the way Jane spoke to the soil, how she cleaned her tools afterward, how she didn't linger once her work was done. She never asked if he was watching. She never performed. She simply came, planted, tended, and left. The others, however, had long given up the charade. Claire had returned to sunbathing and mirror selfies, bemoaning the state of her cuticles and calling the estate's rustic elements quaint. Olivia had grown more distant, but not idle. She had begun to linger in the hallways when Elias passed, offering brief, timed smiles and making a show of reading psychology books in the drawing room as if hoping he would see her as intellectual and caring. He didn't. But what neither of the girls realized was that the estate itself had begun to change. Not physically, its walls were as regal as ever, but in tone, in undercurrent. The house, as Madeline had once said, watched everything. And now it had begun to whisper. The staff spoke more quietly when passing each other. Doors seemed to creak louder than usual. Even the clocks ticked with an edge. Jane noticed it one night when she passed the library and saw Olivia sitting alone, her phone face down, her jaw clenched. She looked up too quickly when Jane approached, muttered something about needing space, and disappeared down the hall. Jane didn't think much of it then, but the next day she found Claire and Olivia whispering together behind a curtain near the solarium. When they noticed her, they smiled too broadly, too quickly. Claire complimented her sweater. Olivia asked about her lavender. Both had never spoken to her with such interest before. It wasn't until dinner that Jane began to understand something was off. Elias had joined them again. It was only the third time he'd done so since their arrival, and as always, he said little, but his presence shifted the atmosphere. Claire, who had spent days pretending he didn't exist, now leaned forward in her chair and offered him wine. Olivia praised the design of the greenhouse, calling it elegant and masculine. Jane, puzzled, remained quiet. Elias, to his credit, did not respond. He ate slowly, listening, eyes never quite meeting anyone's. Only once, near the end of the meal, did he glance at Jane, and that glance said more than words could. She saw the confusion in his face, the skepticism. He had noticed the change, too. Later that evening, as shadows stretched across the corridors and the chandeliers dimmed to their night settings, Olivia knocked on Claire's door. She carried 2 glasses of wine, a notebook, and her phone. "We need to do something," she said as Claire let her in. "She's getting too close." Claire narrowed her eyes. "Who? Jane?" Olivia sat, crossing her legs. "Obviously. You saw the way he looked at her tonight. She's getting under his skin." Claire scoffed. "Please, she's plain, no makeup, no sense of style. She looks like she wandered in from a bookstore in the woods." "And yet," Olivia said, "he watches her like she's a secret. That's a problem." Claire swirled her wine. "So, what do you suggest?" "We remind him who she really is." The plan was simple. Too simple, in fact, but that made it more dangerous. A few days earlier, Jane had confided, briefly, that she had once documented her life daily, even recording herself in vulnerable moments to stay grounded. Olivia remembered the way Jane had looked at her feet while saying it, embarrassed, like someone revealing a bad habit. That was all Olivia needed. She planted the idea with Claire. They would catch Jane on camera saying something contradictory, something damning. Perhaps they could provoke her into admitting she was here for personal gain, or worse, claiming she had come only for content. All it would take was one video, one piece of evidence. Then they'd show Elias. Or better, Madeline. Claire liked the idea immediately. "He needs a wake-up call," she said, and so the whisper campaign began. The next morning, Claire accidentally knocked over a tray of breakfast juice near Jane's feet and hissed, "Farm girl." Olivia pretended to apologize on Claire's behalf, leading Jane away, asking questions about her hometown, her past work, what she really thought about the estate. Jane, tired from the early clinic visit and irritated by the morning's mess, gave clipped answers, but they weren't enough. So Olivia tried something else. 2 nights later, she invited Jane to her room under the pretense of wanting to talk privately. She offered her a glass of wine and spoke in soft, confessional tones. She mentioned how hard it was to be in a place like this, how uncertain everything felt. Jane, ever cautious, drank slowly, trying to keep up. It was Olivia's smile, wide and artificial, that finally made Jane pause. "You're recording this," she said quietly. Olivia blinked, then laughed. "What? Of course not." But Jane was already standing. "I'm going to bed." That was when the plan shifted. Claire proposed they frame her instead. Use Jane's own footage, find her camera, extract audio or clips and edit them out of context. Olivia hesitated. What if she's telling the truth? What if she really is different? Claire snorted. There's no such thing as different. Everyone wants something. The following day, Elias was walking the hall, truly walking, though with effort, his arms braced on a narrow cane, his legs shaky but functional. He moved carefully, ensuring the girls didn't see. Only Madeline and one nurse knew he had begun to regain control of his lower limbs. He wasn't ready to reveal that truth yet. As he turned the corner near the drawing room, he heard voices. Claire and Olivia, low and close. He won't know the difference. She doesn't deserve to win. Just wait till he hears the audio. He stopped. That night, he summoned Jane to the terrace. She came quietly, without question. The moon hung low behind drifting clouds, and the lanterns along the railing flickered like old memories. "I want to ask you something," Elias said, his voice almost uncertain. She nodded. If this all ended tomorrow, if the house vanished, the garden died, the lights went out, what would you miss? Jane thought for a long time. "Not the house," she said. "Not the meals or the rooms. I think I'd miss the sound of the soil when I water it, the way the children at the clinic lean in when I read, and maybe," she paused, "maybe I'd miss you." Elias didn't reply, but in the quiet that followed, he felt something shift inside, a door unlocking, a mask slipping, and deep in the house, in the room where the surveillance monitors were kept, Madeline sat in the dark, watching the girls' rooms through a series of quiet screens. On one monitor, Claire and Olivia sat with wine and whispers. On another, Jane read alone beneath a lamp, her lips moving silently, tracing each word as if it were precious. Madeline leaned back in her chair, her fingers folded beneath her chin. She had seen this before, and she was waiting. It began with a lie, a quiet, believable lie, delivered with such sincerity that even Madeline James, a woman who had heard every kind of manipulation the world had to offer, felt her heart pause for a moment. It was just after breakfast, and the 3 young women were seated in the glass atrium, sipping fresh juice and speaking in civil tones, though the air among them had thickened with invisible lines of battle. Jane had grown more cautious over the past few days, as if her instincts were sharpening. Claire and Olivia were behaving too well. Their smiles too smooth, their voices too sweet. Jane had stopped sharing things, stopped sitting too long with either of them, but she had not yet realized how far they had already gone. Elias did. He had heard the fragments of conversation in the hall, the whispers exchanged behind closed doors. He had noticed the glances Olivia gave Jane when she thought no one was watching, the forced laughter Claire directed at things that weren't funny. He had seen their hands, the way they clutched their wine glasses tightly when Madeleine entered a room, as if afraid she might summon judgment with a single word. And so, Elias made a decision. He would end the game. That evening, after the girls had retired to their rooms, after the last dishes had been cleared from the dining table and the staff dismissed for the night, Elias asked his mother to meet him in the drawing room. The fire had already been lit. Shadows danced across the high ceilings, casting wavering silhouettes of the two silent figures seated across from one another. "I want to tell them," Elias said. Madeleine raised an eyebrow. "Tell them what?" "That I've lost everything." Her silence stretched. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "I need to see what they do when they think there's nothing left." And so, the next day, he told them. The girls were called into the great hall. Elias sat in his wheelchair, flanked by Madeleine, who stood a little behind him, her expression unreadable. The room, with its towering windows and ornate crown moldings, looked less grand under the weight of the words that followed. "I want to be honest with you," Elias began, his voice calm, practiced. 3 years ago, I invested in a project that I believed in, deeply. It was meant to be a new beginning for inner-city housing development, something I thought could change lives. Claire's eyes lit up for a moment, as if expecting another grand reveal. But the project failed, Elias continued, spectacularly. The partners I trusted walked away. The money, my family's resources, vanished with them. In desperation, I used this estate as collateral for a final loan. Now, Olivia leaned forward slightly, her brows beginning to pinch. "I lost that too," he said simply. "We have 1 week before the bank repossesses this house." Claire laughed once, short and sharp, until she saw no one else smiling. Then her face froze. Olivia crossed her arms, but her fingers trembled. Only Jane remained still. Her gaze never left Elias's. Madeleine, whose poise rarely cracked, took 1 step forward. "I'm telling you this," she said, "because you deserve the truth. If any of you wish to leave, we won't stop you. But there will be no money, no estate, no future promises." Claire stood almost immediately. "So there's nothing left?" Elias said nothing. No investments, no backup plan. Still silence. Claire turned to Olivia, waiting for a cue, a signal, an excuse. Olivia gave none. Instead, she turned her head slightly toward Jane, then back to Elias. "I'm sorry," Claire said. "I should go call my agent." She left the room, her heels echoing across the marble. Olivia hesitated, then said, "I'd like to think about it." Elias nodded. "Take your time." Jane didn't speak until later that evening. She found Elias on the rear terrace wrapped in a wool blanket, his hands resting quietly on his lap. She walked out without a word, sat in the chair beside him, and looked up at the moon. "I'm sorry," she said finally. He turned his head slightly. "For what?" "For what this place meant to you. I know what it's like to lose something you believed in." He didn't answer. They sat in silence for several minutes. Then Jane said softly, "If it's all right, I'd like to keep helping at the clinic, even if I'm not staying here." "You can do whatever you want," he said, "but I want to stay." Elias turned his eyes toward her, uncertain. "Why?" Because I didn't come here for the money, she said. At first, maybe I was curious. But that changed. I stayed because I started to see the people, the pain, the healing. I stayed because I saw you. He looked away, but the next morning, Jane received a tray of breakfast outside her door, and on it, tucked beneath a linen napkin, was a small note in handwriting she recognized. Stay as long as you like. Meanwhile, across the hall, Olivia was making a phone call. Her voice was hushed but urgent. Yes, I'm sure. He said it himself. They've lost everything. The voice on the other end of the line, the boyfriend no one at the estate knew existed, cursed under his breath. After all this time, he hissed. So you wasted your chance? No, Olivia snapped. There's still something left. What? Gold, jewelry. Madeline has a whole collection in a locked armoire in her suite. I've seen it. There was silence, then a slow, dangerous laugh. Then take it, while you still can. Tonight, Olivia whispered. I'll call you when I have it. That night, while Jane was helping the kitchen staff clean up after dinner, while Elias sat reading in the library and Madeline met with the state lawyers in her study, Olivia crept into the east wing. She moved in silence, barefoot, dressed in black. She picked the lock easily. Her boyfriend had trained her well, and began filling a travel bag with gold bangles, pearl earrings, diamond-encrusted pins. She was nearly finished when a voice called out from the shadows. Going somewhere? Olivia turned, heart pounding. A security guard stepped forward, flashlight raised. It's not what it looks like, she said quickly, then opened the bag. Before she could speak, another voice rang out, calmer, stronger. Olivia. It was Elias. He was standing. No wheelchair, no cane. Olivia stared. You're not. No, he said, I'm not paralyzed. Not anymore. Madeline stepped into the room behind him, flanked by 2 more staff members. We know everything, she said coldly. Olivia dropped the bag. Please, let me explain. There's nothing left to say, Elias said. We gave you the truth, and you answered with theft. I needed it, Olivia cried. I thought. You thought you could take what you didn't earn, Madeline finished. The guards escorted her out of the house. The next morning, the sun rose on a quieter mansion. Jane watered her lavender without knowing what had happened in the night. She only noticed that Claire was gone and Olivia's room sat empty. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. The house felt quieter and not just in sound. It was a silence that carried meaning, the kind that follows the crash of a storm. The grand halls of the James estate, once echoing with footsteps and whispers, now seemed to breathe slower. Olivia was gone. Claire had disappeared days before her, retreating into whatever glamorous world she came from, taking her designer luggage and well-rehearsed charm with her. All that remained was Jane, and the truth. Jane woke late that morning, the warmth of the sun already pressing through the tall windows of her room. The linens on her bed were slightly tangled, her sleep restless. She had sensed the shift in the atmosphere. Something had happened the night before, something final. She stepped into her slippers and crossed the room to the window. Outside, the garden stretched in quiet perfection, her lavender still holding strong in the soil she had turned with her own hands. A bird flitted across the lawn. Somewhere beyond the hedges, a gardener's rake scraped gently against gravel. Only 2 guests remained now, and one of them wasn't really a guest anymore. Jane dressed quickly, tugging on jeans and a soft gray sweater. She skipped breakfast, choosing instead to walk the perimeter of the estate. She didn't run into Elias. Not yet. but she passed staff who nodded to her with a different sort of politeness now, not the cautious civility of hosts tolerating a stranger, but the acknowledgment given to someone who had, in their quiet way, earned a place. By mid-morning, she found herself in the solarium, a book in hand, though her eyes barely grazed the page. The door opened softly behind her, and she didn't need to turn to know who it was. Elias stepped in. No wheelchair this time, but his stride was still slow, deliberate. He held himself with quiet strength, as if unused to the weight of his own legs. Jane looked up as he approached. Their eyes met, and she set the book aside without a word. "I owe you a conversation," he said. Jane didn't answer, waiting. Elias sat across from her, hands folded loosely in his lap. The morning light made his features softer, less guarded than she'd ever seen them. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then finally he said, "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For everything. For doubting you. For testing you. For letting all this become what it became." Jane's brow furrowed. "I understand why you did it." He looked away. "That doesn't make it right." A pause settled between them. Jane felt the weight of it. Not uncomfortable, but real. She had waited for this moment, not in anticipation of apology, but for clarity, for truth. "You said you wanted to see who would stay if the money disappeared," she said quietly. "Yes. And now?" He leaned forward slightly. "Now I want to see who stays for me." The words hung in the air like fragile glass. Jane swallowed. "I didn't come here for love. Not at first." "I know." She looked down at her hands. "I came because I needed direction, because I thought this was a strange opportunity I could turn into something useful, content maybe, a story." Elias didn't flinch. "But something happened," she continued, "at the clinic, in the garden, with you. I started seeing things I didn't expect, people, pain, strength. I saw the way you looked at others when you thought they weren't watching. I saw how much you were trying not to feel anything." He met her eyes. "And now?" Jane's voice trembled just slightly. "Now, I don't care about the story. I care about the ending." Elias's lips curved. Not a full smile, but the beginning of one. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something not to her, but to himself. That afternoon, the estate returned to something resembling calm. Jane resumed her daily work at the clinic, accompanied for the first time by Elias himself, who insisted on seeing what she saw. The children welcomed him with open arms. Though his presence was new to them, there was no hesitation in the way they held his hands, leaned against his side, asked him if he could play. He smiled more that day than he had in months. At dinner, the table was set for 3, Elias, Jane, and Madeline. The setting was simple, the meal quiet. Madeline watched the two of them closely, and when Elias offered to serve Jane more of the roasted vegetables, her expression changed. Not with surprise, but with recognition. She had hoped for this, not forced, not arranged, not manipulated, but earned. That night, long after the dishes were cleared and the house began to dim for sleep, Jane sat in her room writing, not for the internet, not for her audience, but for herself. She wrote about lavender, about children with crooked teeth and eyes full of questions. She wrote about pain that hides behind sarcasm, about honesty spoken in gardens, and apologies whispered under skylights. She didn't hear the knock at first. When she opened the door, Elias stood there, barefoot and unsure. "Can we walk?" She nodded, and together they stepped into the cool night. The garden was silent, save for the occasional chirp of a cricket or the rustle of leaves. They walked slowly, neither speaking at first. Then Elias said, "I told my mother today. Told her what? That I want to keep this place, not because of the money, because it's where I remembered who I was. Jane looked up at him. And who's that? A man who can start over. They reached the lavender patch, and he bent slightly to touch the soft leaves. You kept this alive. So did the rain, she said with a small smile. No, he replied. You did. He turned to face her fully. I want to know if there's a version of this where you stay, not just here, with me. Jane's breath caught. I don't know. Elias didn't move. That's okay. Just tell me you'll think about it. I'll think about it, she whispered. He nodded once and stepped back, leaving her in the garden. But the next morning, something cracked the peace. Jane woke to find her camera missing. She tore through drawers, bags, shelves. Nothing. Panic flared in her chest. She hadn't used it in days, not since she had stopped documenting, but there were old files on it, pieces of video that could be misunderstood. She found it later in the hallway outside the drawing room. The lens was smudged, the memory card missing. She raced to the solarium, heart pounding. Inside, Madeline sat with a small velvet box on her lap. Jane hesitated in the doorway. Come in, Madeline said without looking up. Jane stepped forward. I assume you're looking for this? Madeline opened the box to reveal the missing memory card. Jane's stomach dropped. Where did you find it? On the floor in the hallway, Madeline replied. Apparently, someone tried to use it. Jane blinked. I didn't. I know, Madeline said. Silence. I watched the footage. Jane opened her mouth, then closed it. I saw the early recordings, Madeline continued. You film in the house, yourself, the clinic, your voice, narrating, your questions, your doubts. Jane lowered her gaze. And then, Madeline said, you stopped. I didn't mean... You didn't have to, Madeline interrupted gently. You're not the first person who came here with a plan, but you're the first who let it go. Jane's throat tightened. I wanted to give you this, Madeline said, holding up the box, so you'd know that the truth can be ugly and still survive. Jane reached for it, but Madeline held on a moment longer. Take care of what you love, she said, and it will take care of you. Jane left the room in tears. That night, Elias sat in his room, sketching. It was a habit he hadn't returned to in full, but tonight he felt compelled. He drew the garden again, this time with a figure kneeling in the lavender, her head bowed, her hands in the soil. He didn't sign it. He just left it on Jane's door. And in her room, Jane sat holding the velvet box. It was empty now, but she felt fuller than she had in years. It was a quiet morning after a long night of rain. The earth, dark and tender, clung to the roots of the garden as if holding a secret. The scent of wet leaves drifted through the open windows of the James estate, carried on the gentle breeze that stirred the curtains like breath. Everything was softer that day. The world, perhaps sensing that something delicate had shifted, took care not to break the calm. Jane sat in the garden with her shoes off, her bare feet tucked beneath her as she watched the way the lavender swayed in the sunlight. Her fingertips brushed along the purple stems, still beaded with drops of rain. The silence no longer unnerved her. It felt earned, like peace that had waited for permission to return. She had not seen Elias that morning, but she had found his sketch at her door just before dawn. The paper was folded once, no note attached, no signature. She hadn't needed one. She knew his lines, his shading, the way he curved shadows into motion. The figure he'd drawn looked like her, though she couldn't be sure. She only knew that whoever it was, They had been captured in a moment of stillness, kneeling in the earth as if asking it a question. She had cried quietly when she saw it. Now she watched bees float lazily from flower to flower, unaware of anything but the rhythm of their work. Her thoughts drifted like the petals around her, scattered, gentle, unsure. The estate had changed in just a few weeks. It felt less like a fortress now and more like a home, though she had not yet decided if it would be hers. The rooms no longer whispered warnings. The halls no longer echoed with calculation. Claire and Olivia had taken their shadows with them. The light that replaced them was honest and bright. Madeline found her in the garden just after midday. She didn't say anything at first, only stood there, hands clasped loosely in front of her, the wind gently lifting the hem of her linen blouse. Jane turned, squinting against the sun. "Would you walk with me?" Madeline asked. Jane nodded, rising slowly, brushing the soil from her jeans. They walked in silence for a time, following the path that wound through the rose arbor and down toward the pond. The water shimmered like silver. "I wanted to thank you," Madeline said eventually. Jane looked at her with surprise. "Me?" "For staying," Madeline said, her voice soft. "For not pretending. For seeing things I wasn't sure anyone else could." "I wasn't sure myself," Jane admitted. They paused at the edge of the pond. A pair of swans drifted across the water, their movements mirrored in the perfect reflection below. "My son," Madeline began, and then paused as if the words were still fragile, "has been lost for a long time. He wouldn't let me help him, wouldn't let anyone in. I tried everything, doctors, therapists, even spiritual advisors. Nothing reached him." Jane listened. "But you did." Jane's eyes filled slightly. "I didn't mean to. I think that's why it worked." They sat on the bench together, letting the quiet fill in the rest. Later that afternoon, Elias emerged from the east wing, walking without assistance. His steps were slow but sure, his frame steadier than it had been since his accident. Staff passed him in the hallway with warm nods, no longer surprised. The story of his recovery, once a secret, had spread through the household in quiet gratitude. It had given them something to believe in. He found Jane in the library, seated on the floor by the tall windows, a pile of books around her. She looked up when he entered, smiling. "Working on something?" he asked. "Sorting through books I don't need to read," she replied, "but they're hard to let go of." He sat beside her, not on a chair but on the floor, knees bent, hands resting loosely in his lap. "I've been thinking," he said, "about starting something here." Jane tilted her head. "A program," Elias continued, "a residency for young people with injuries, disabilities, people like me. A space where they can work on art, architecture, whatever they want, where they're not treated like patients or survivors, just people." Jane's heart stirred. "I want you to help me build it." She blinked. "Me?" He nodded. "You see people, that's the hardest part." She didn't respond immediately. Her fingers curled around the spine of a book she hadn't opened. After a moment, she whispered, "I'd like that." They sat in silence for a while longer, then Jane turned to him. "There's something else." He looked at her. "I think I do love you," she said quietly, "but I don't want to say it like it's a prize or a confession. I just need you to know." Elias didn't speak. He only reached for her hand and held it, neither of them needing anything more. The days that followed moved like warm wind, slow, comforting, free. Jane continued to help at the clinic. Elias began sketching designs for the program he had envisioned, now calling it by a name Jane had suggested, the Second Bloom. Staff helped clear a wing of the estate for renovation. Madeline watched everything from a quiet distance, content, finally, to step back and let the future arrive without her arranging its every move. And then, one golden afternoon, Elias stood at the heart of the garden and waited. Jane came without asking why. She knew. She had seen it in the way he watched her lately, not with hunger or doubt, but with quiet knowing. He wore a linen shirt and dark trousers, his hair swept back, his shoulders loose. In his hand was a small black box. He didn't kneel. He didn't speak. He only opened it to reveal a simple ring, a silver band with a small sun-etched stone. Jane stared at it. Then she looked up at him. Her voice was barely a breath. Yes. 3 months later, the garden was filled with chairs, music, and soft laughter. Friends and staff gathered beneath white canopies adorned with wildflowers, the scent of fresh bread and citrus hanging in the air. Jane wore a dress of soft cream, her hair curled loosely around her shoulders. Elias waited beneath the arbor, standing tall and steady. Madeline wept quietly into a handkerchief as the two exchanged vows written not on paper, but from memory. "You may now kiss the bride," said the old minister, his smile wide with warmth. And so he did. The crowd applauded. Birds scattered into the sky like a blessing. That night, as the sun dipped low and music drifted through the open windows of the ballroom, Jane found herself alone in the lavender garden. She stood barefoot in the dirt, letting it press against her skin. The same earth she had worked when no one was watching. The same patch Elias had drawn. She looked up at the stars emerging above the roofline and smiled. Inside the house, Madeline poured tea for a guest from the city, an investor interested in supporting the second bloom. In the nursery upstairs, a tiny pair of slippers waited beside a rocking chair. Not yet used, but waiting. Time had not paused for them, but it had softened, allowed them a second chance. The mansion, which had once felt like a place where nothing could grow, now pulsed with life, full of people who didn't come for wealth or pretense, but for something simpler, something harder to name. Something real. And somewhere inside, beneath a stack of letters and folded laundry, lay a memory card in a velvet box. Unused, unneeded, forgotten, but never erased. Because some stories are better lived than told. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. And let us know in the comments what part touched you the most. Share this video with someone who loves a good story.